bread was already cold by the time Nadia reached the gate. She had run 6 blocks to get there, cutting through the narrow alley behind the fishmonger's stall because it was faster, even though the smell clung to her coat for hours afterward. She did not care about the smell anymore. She cared about getting there before the kitchen staff decided the evening was over and bolted the iron gate shut for the night. She had missed it once before, 3 weeks ago, and she had gone to bed that night with nothing but rainwater she had caught in a tin cup. She was not going to miss it again. She arrived at the gate with her heart hammering, and her breath coming out in white clouds in the cold evening air. The gate was still open. A woman in a gray apron stood just inside it, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle. Nadia slowed to a walk. She had learned early that running toward food looked desperate, and desperate people made other people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people closed gates. She walked the last few steps with her hands at her sides and her chin up. The woman in the apron looked at her. She was not unkind. She had a tired face and red hands from working in a hot kitchen all day. And she looked at Nadia the way most adults looked at Nadia, with a mixture of pity and slight guilt, as though Nadia were a problem that someone else was supposed to have already solved. "You're late," the woman said. "I know," Nadia said. "I'm sorry. I had to come from the east side." The woman looked at the bundle in her hands, and then back at Nadia. She unwrapped one corner of the cloth and pulled out half a loaf of bread, slightly flattened on one side, where it had been pressed against something. She held it out. Nadia took it with both hands. "Thank you," she said. She said it clearly, not mumbling it or rushing past it, the way she had noticed some of the other children did. She said it like she meant it, because she did. The woman nodded, looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary, and then pulled the gate closed. The iron lock clicked. Nadia stood on the outside with the half loaf in her hands, and the sound of the city filling the space around her. Cartwheels on cobblestones, a dog barking 2 streets away, a man singing something tuneless somewhere above her head. She found her usual spot around the corner, behind a low stone wall that blocked most of the wind, and she sat down with her back against the stone and ate the bread slowly. She had trained herself to eat slowly. It was harder than it sounded. Every part of her body wanted to eat fast, to get as much in as quickly as possible before something happened, before someone took it, before it somehow disappeared. But she had learned that eating fast made her sick, and being sick when you had nowhere warm to lie down was one of the worst things she could imagine. So she ate slowly, tearing small pieces, chewing each one fully, letting herself taste it. It was good bread. It had herbs in it, something green and sharp that she did not know the name of. Whoever baked bread in that kitchen knew what they were doing. She thought about that sometimes, about the person who had baked this bread, who had stood in a warm kitchen and pressed herbs into dough and slid it into an oven, completely unaware that their work would end up in the hands of a 12-year-old girl, sitting behind a wall in the dark. She thought about things like that a lot. It kept her mind busy. When the bread was half gone, she stopped. She wrapped the rest carefully in the piece of cloth she kept in her coat pocket for exactly this purpose. Breakfast. She would have it in the morning, and it would carry her through until she could find something else. She pulled her coat tighter around herself. The coat was far too large for her. It had been a man's coat once, heavy brown wool, and it came down past her knees. She had found it folded on top of a rubbish pile 6 months ago, and she had taken it without hesitating. It was one of the best things that had ever happened to her. The coat was warm enough that she could sleep outside on most nights without being in serious danger, as long as she found a spot that was sheltered from the wind. She was still thinking about the bread, about the herbs in it, when she heard the gate open again. She did not look up immediately. People came and went through that gate. It was probably the kitchen woman putting out the rubbish. But the footsteps came around the corner. She looked up then. A man was standing at the edge of her small shelter behind the wall, looking at her. He was tall, perhaps 60 years old, with gray hair and a serious face. He was wearing a very good coat, dark wool, perfectly fitted, with brass buttons. He was the kind of man who did not usually walk around this part of the city at this hour, and something about seeing him here, in this alley, made Nadia's whole body go very still. She did not run. She had learned that running was almost always the wrong choice. Running made people chase you, and people who chased you were almost never doing it to give you something good. She looked at him steadily. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, That is my gate. Nadia considered this. I know, she said. You come here every Tuesday. She did not answer that. It was not a question. The man took a step closer and crouched down so that he was at her eye level, which surprised her. Men of his kind did not usually do that. They stood above you and looked down at you when they spoke. What is your name? He asked. She looked at him. She had a rule about giving her name to strangers. But something about this man, the fact that he was crouching, the fact that he was asking instead of demanding, the fact that he had come around the corner himself instead of sending someone, made her answer. Nadia, she said. Nadia what? There was a pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. She would remember those 2 seconds for the rest of her life, though she did not know it yet. Voss, she said. Nadia Voss. Something happened to the man's face. It was very small and very fast, and she almost missed it. A flicker, like a candle flame in a draft. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind it shifted, as though a door somewhere inside him had opened a crack and then immediately been pulled closed again. I see, he said. His voice was perfectly calm. Are you warm enough? It was such an unexpected question that she blinked. No one asked her that. People asked her what she was doing here, or told her to move along, or handed her something and walked away. No one simply asked if she was warm enough. I'm fine, she said, because that was what she always said. He looked at her coat for a moment. He looked at her hands, which were reddened from the cold even inside the coat's sleeves. He looked at the half-eaten loaf on her lap. Next Tuesday, he said, come to the front door instead of the gate. Ask for Mrs. Alton and tell her Lord Ashford sent you. She will give you a proper meal. Then he stood up, straightened his coat, and walked back around the corner. She heard the gate open and close again. Nadia sat very still for a long time. She looked down at the bread in her lap. She looked at the corner of the wall where he had stood. She turned over his words in her mind, the way she turned over objects she found in the street, carefully, checking every side, looking for the part that would explain what they really were. Lord Ashford. She had heard that name before. Everyone in this part of the city had. The Ashford Manor was one of the largest houses in the district, a wide stone building with a proper garden behind iron fencing, and Lord Ashford was known to be a private man who rarely appeared in public and never attended the events that other wealthy men attended. She had heard him described as cold by some people and as simply serious by others. She had never heard anyone say he was the kind of man who crouched down in an alley to speak to a homeless child. She ate the rest of the bread. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her usual doorway, the deep-set entrance of a closed bookshop that was sheltered enough to keep the rain off, and she stared at the sky above the rooftops and thought about the man with the brass-buttoned coat. She thought about the look on his face when she told him her name. She did not know what it meant, but she knew it had meant something. She turned over in her coat, pulled the edge of it around her feet, and told herself it was probably nothing. People had reactions to names all the time. Names reminded people of other people. That was all it was. She closed her eyes. But the look on his face stayed with her, floating behind her eyelids in the dark. The next morning she woke, before the sky was fully light, as she always did. The street was quiet in the way that streets were only quiet in that narrow hour between the end of the night and the beginning of the day, when even the earliest workers had not yet come out. She sat up, stretched the stiffness out of her back, and unwrapped the rest of the bread from the cloth in her pocket. She ate it in 4 small bites. She stood up, straightened the oversized coat around herself, and decided what she was going to do with the day. She had a small collection of routines that kept her moving. On mornings when the market was open, she went to the East Quarter, where a man named Jeffrey let her help him carry things, in exchange for whatever was left at the end of the day, usually bruised fruit or vegetables that were not quite right enough to sell. On other mornings, she went to the church on Mercer Street, where a woman called Sister Agnes ran a breakfast table for anyone who arrived before 8. Sister Agnes never asked questions and never gave lectures. She simply gave out bowls of porridge and cups of tea and nodded at everyone who came through the door as though they were exactly the people she had been expecting. She sat at the long wooden table with 5 other people, an old man who came every day and always sat at the same end, a young woman with a baby bundled against her chest, 2 boys about Nadia's age who whispered to each other and ate very fast, and a thin man in a carpenter's apron who looked like he had simply fallen on difficult times and had not yet found his way back out of them. Sister Agnes came around with the pot and filled Nadia's bowl without being asked. "Cold last night?" she asked. "Not too bad," Nadia said. Sister Agnes gave her a look that said she did not entirely believe this, but was not going to argue about it. She moved on to the next person. Nadia ate the porridge and drank the tea and felt warmth spread through her slowly, the way warmth always did after a cold night, reaching the tips of her fingers last of all. She thought about Tuesday. She thought about whether she would go. The front door, he had said, not the gate. Ask for Mrs. Alton. It was possible it was a kind impulse that he would forget by Tuesday. Men of his kind had impulses like that sometimes, a moment of genuine warmth when they saw something in the street that moved them, and then the warmth faded as soon as they went back inside their warm houses and sat down at their warm tables, and by the time Tuesday came around he would have forgotten entirely, and Mrs. Alton would look at her blankly and tell her to go to the gate like everyone else. That was the most likely thing. She told herself that was the most likely thing. But she kept thinking about the look on his face. She had seen a lot of faces in 2 years on the street. She had become very good at reading them quickly, the way you had to become good at things quickly when your safety depended on it. She had learned to tell the difference between the face of someone who was going to leave her alone and the face of someone who was not. She had learned to tell kindness from guilt, and pity from contempt, and genuine concern from the kind of performing concern that people sometimes did when they wanted to feel good about themselves. The look on Lord Ashford's face, when she said her name, had not been any of those things. It had been something she did not have a word for yet, something that came from very deep inside him, from a place he did not usually let show. She finished the porridge, thanked Sister Agnes, and walked out into the morning. The city was waking up around her, shutters being opened, carts beginning to move, the smell of coal smoke mixing with the smell of bread from the bakeries that had been up since before dawn. She moved through it all with the particular ease of someone who had learned to exist in a city without taking up very much space, walking close to the walls, stepping around people without making them step around her first, always keeping one eye on the exit of whatever space she was in. She worked with Geoffrey at the market that day, and came away in the late afternoon with 4 apples, a small parsnip, and a coin he pressed into her hand unexpectedly, telling her she had worked harder than most adults he knew. She thanked him, and put the coin very carefully into the small knotted cloth she kept tied inside the lining of her coat, where it sat with 2 other coins she had saved over the past month. She did not spend coins unless she absolutely had to. The afternoon faded into evening, and the evening cooled quickly. She found her doorway, ate one of the apples, and sat watching the street for a while before the dark convinced her to stop watching and try to sleep. The week passed in the particular way that weeks passed for her, not as a series of days with names and meanings, but as a series of problems to solve and resources to find. She did not think much about the future because the future was too large and uncertain to be useful. She thought about the next meal, the next night, the next cold front coming in from the west that she could see building in the clouds above the rooftops. On Tuesday morning, she woke up and knew immediately that she was going to go. She could not have explained why, exactly. She only knew that the look on that man's face had been real, and she had gotten very good at knowing the difference between things that were real and things that were not. She found a water trough near the stable yard 2 streets from her doorway, and washed her face and hands with the cold water, smoothing her hair back as best she could with her wet fingers. She could not do much about the coat or the worn state of her shoes, but she could at least have a clean face. She arrived at the front door of Ashford Manor at the time that felt right, not too early, not in the middle of what would probably be their dinner. She stood at the door for a moment before knocking. It was a large wooden door, painted black, with a heavy brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The house rose above her, wide and solid, and certain of itself in a way that very few things in her life were. She lifted the lion's head and knocked 3 times. The door was opened by a young man in a dark jacket, who looked at her without any particular expression. "I'm looking for Mrs. Alton," Nadia said. "Lord Ashford sent me." The young man looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door wider and said, "Come in, and wait here." She stepped inside. She had never been inside a house like this. She had been inside houses before, smaller ones, ordinary ones, the homes of people who had taken her in briefly, before situations changed, and they no longer could. But this was different. The entrance hall was high-ceilinged and quiet, with a marble floor and dark wood panels on the walls, and a lamp burning in a glass bracket that threw soft yellow light over everything. It smelled of beeswax and something floral, and underneath that, very faintly, of a fire burning somewhere deeper in the house. She stood very still on the mat just inside the door, with her hands at her sides, and did not touch anything. A woman appeared from a doorway at the end of the hall. She was perhaps 50, with gray hair pulled neatly back and a composed, careful face. She walked toward Nadia with measured steps, and stopped a few feet away, looking at her with an expression that was hard to read. "You are Nadia?" she said. "Yes," Nadia said. The woman, this must be Mrs. Alton, looked at her for another moment, and something shifted very slightly in her expression, not quite softening, more like confirming. "Come with me," she said. She led Nadia not to the kitchen, as Nadia had expected, but to a small sitting room off the hall, where a fire was lit and 2 chairs faced each other across a low table. On the table was a tray with bread, butter, sliced cold meat, a small pot of something dark and sweet-smelling, and a pot of tea. Nadia looked at the food. She looked at Mrs. Alton. Mrs. Alton gestured at the chair closest to the fire. "Sit down," she said. "Lord Ashford will be down shortly." Nadia sat down. She did not touch the food, though everything inside her wanted to. She folded her hands in her lap and sat straight in the chair and waited, the way she had learned to wait, without fidgeting, without showing anything on her face that she did not want to show. She heard footsteps on the stairs, measured, even footsteps. And then Lord Ashford walked into the room, and everything that had happened in Nadia's life, every cold night, every careful meal, every moment of learning to survive the things that had been handed to her, all of it had somehow led to this particular evening, in this particular chair, across from this particular man, though she did not know that yet. She simply sat up a little straighter and looked at him, waiting to find out what he wanted. He sat down across from her. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her in the alley, with that serious, searching look that went a little deeper than most people's. "Pour yourself some tea," he said, "and please eat. I asked Mrs. Alton to prepare something proper." She poured the tea. She put bread on the small plate beside her and spread butter on it with the knife. She was very careful to do it exactly as she would have done it if someone had been watching her do it her whole life, which no one had been. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. She took a bite of the bread first. Then she said, 2 years. "How old are you now?" 12. He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her hands, and then at her face, and then at some middle distance beyond her that was not anything in the room. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. "I lived with my aunt," Nadia said. "Greta Voss, on the north side." "And before that?" She paused. "I don't really know much about before that. My aunt told me my mother died when I was very small, and that there was no one else." He was quiet. The fire in the grate made a small sound, a soft pop, and then the quiet returned. "What was your mother's name?" he asked. It was such a simple question. Nadia had been asked it once or twice over the years, by adults who were trying to piece together who she was or where she came from, and she had always answered it the same way, because it was the only information she had. "Clara," she said. "That's all I know. My aunt didn't talk about her much." Lord Ashford picked up his teacup. He brought it almost to his lips, and then he set it back down without drinking from it. "I see," he said very quietly. Nadia looked at him. There it was again, that thing behind his face, that door, opening a crack and pulling shut. But this time it stayed open a little longer, and she caught just a glimpse of something vast and aching behind it, before he brought his expression back under control. She ate the bread. She poured more tea. She waited. He seemed to come to some decision. He straightened in his chair and looked at her directly. "I would like you to come here on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said. "Mrs. Alton will have a meal ready. I have a few questions I would like to ask you over the coming weeks, if you are willing." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to finish chewing. "All right," she said. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had already decided. He stood, and she stood too, and he extended his hand to her across the table. It was an unusual thing for a man of his position to do with a 12-year-old homeless girl, to offer to shake her hand, as though she were a person of equal standing. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "Tuesday and Thursday," he said. "Front door. Ask for Mrs. Alton." "I'll be here," she said. She left the manor that night with a full stomach and the cloth-wrapped parcel of food Mrs. Alton had pressed into her hands at the door. She walked back through the darkening streets, and the city was exactly the same as it had always been. The noise and the cold and the smell of it, the way it moved around her without noticing her. But she was not quite the same inside it. Something had shifted. She did not know what it was yet. She could feel it the way you could feel a change in the weather before the clouds came, something in the pressure of the air, something that made the hairs on your arms stand up without being able to say exactly why. She found her doorway and settled in for the night, pulling the coat around herself. She unwrapped the cloth parcel from Mrs. Alton. Inside was another portion of bread, 2 slices of cold meat, and a small apple. She held the apple for a moment, turning it over in her hands. Then she put it carefully away for morning and lay back and looked at the sky. Somewhere across the city, in a room lit by firelight, Lord Edmund Ashford sat at a desk with a drawer open in front of him. Inside the drawer was a letter he had not touched in 9 years. His hand hovered over it for a long time. Then he picked it up, and he began, very carefully, to read. She did not know that there was a photograph. She did not know that there was a letter. She did not know that somewhere in the city, a man was sitting with his hands trembling over a piece of paper, putting together the pieces of something she did not even know was broken. She only knew that the bread had been good, and the fire had been warm, and the man with the brass-button coat had shaken her hand like she was a real person. For now, that was enough. But it would not be enough for long. Because some truths are patient. They wait. They hide inside drawers and coat linings, and the spaces between words that people almost say, but do not. And then one day they come out. And when they do, nothing is the same afterward. Not for anyone. The drawer had not been opened in 9 years. Lord Edmund Ashford stood in front of his desk in the dark study, the single lamp on the corner casting a low circle of yellow light across the surface, and looked at the drawer the way a man might look at something he knows will hurt him if he touches it. He had gotten very good, over the years, at not touching it, at walking past this desk on his way to the window and keeping his eyes straight ahead, at sitting on the other side of the room when he worked in the evenings, at the smaller table near the fire, rather than at the main desk where the drawer was. 9 years was a long time to be careful. He pulled the drawer open. The lamplight fell inside and caught the edge of a photograph, the pale oval of a face looking up at him. He did not need to pick it up to know what it showed. He had looked at it so many times in the first year after Clara died that the image was pressed into him as permanently as anything he had ever known. He picked it up anyway. Clara at 24, standing in a garden, looking sideways at whoever held the camera with an expression that was half smile and half something more private. She had always been like that, partly present, partly somewhere else, as though a piece of her was always kept somewhere safe where no one could reach it. He had loved her for 11 years, lost her for 2 of those, and then lost her permanently, before they had fully found their way back to each other. He set the photograph down on the desk and reached back into the drawer. The letter was still there, in its envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges now. Her handwriting on the front, his name in the slanted looping script she had used when she was writing carefully rather than quickly. Edmund, just his name, nothing else on the outside. He sat down. He held the envelope for a moment without opening it. He knew what was inside. He had read it, the one and only time he had ever read it, 8 years and 11 months ago, 3 days after her death, when her solicitor had handed him the envelope and told him it had been left with specific instructions, that it be given to him only after she was gone. He had read it once. He had put it in the drawer. He had closed the drawer. And then he had spent 9 years being very careful. He opened the envelope. The paper inside was 2 sheets, closely written in her hand. He unfolded it on the desk in front of him and smoothed the crease with his palm and made himself read slowly, even though every word was already memorized. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she had made a decision without him. During the 2 years they were separated, a decision she had believed at the time was the only way to keep someone safe when she did not know whether she herself would survive. She wrote that she had been ill, much more seriously ill than she had told anyone, and that in the depth of that illness, she had done what she had done, because she was frightened, and alone, and certain that she was dying. She had been right about the dying, Edmund thought. She had simply been wrong about the timing. She had recovered, the illness had retreated, and then 6 years later it had come back, and this time it had not retreated, and she had died in the autumn of a year, when the leaves fell very early, and very gold. He read on. She wrote about the child. She wrote that she had placed the child with a relative, a woman named Greta Voss, who was her mother's second cousin, a woman she did not know well, but who had presented herself as willing and capable. She had made financial arrangements. She had left money with Greta, enough money to cover the child's care for many years, with the understanding that if Clara recovered, she would come back and take the child home. She had recovered. Edmund put the letter down for a moment and looked at the fire. She had recovered, and she had not gone back. That was the part he had never been able to understand fully, the part that had sat in him like a splinter for 9 years, not the secret itself, because he could understand fear and illness and a desperate decision made alone, but the afterward, the years between, the reason she had not gone back. He picked the letter up again. She wrote about the afterward, in the last paragraph of the first page, and he had never been entirely sure whether her explanation was a full one, or whether there were things even the letter did not say. She had come back to him, she wrote, after she recovered. They had reconciled, and in that reconciliation, in the fragile and careful new beginning they were building together, she had been afraid to introduce an element that might shatter it. She had told herself the child was safe. She had told herself she would tell him when the time was right. She had kept telling herself that through months and then years, the way people keep telling themselves things that they know, somewhere underneath, they are not going to do. And then the illness had returned, and she had written this letter, and the time had never been right. Edmund folded the letter at the bottom of the first page and did not go on. He already knew what the second page said. It said the child's name was Nadia, which had been Clara's mother's name. It said Greta Voss had been given the address on Mercer Hill. It said that Edmund should find her, if he could, and give her what should have been hers. He had not found her. He had read the letter once, and put it in the drawer, and told himself that what Clara had done was between her and God, and that the child, whoever she was being cared for, as Clara had arranged. He had told himself there was no way of knowing whether the child was truly his to find, or whether looking would open wounds in 3 people's lives, without doing anyone any good. He had told himself many careful, reasonable things over the course of 9 years. And then a girl with Clara's exact eyes had stood at his gate and told him her name was Nadia Voss. He sat at the desk for a very long time. The fire burned lower. The lamp oil would need replacing before it went out. He did not get up to replace it. He sat in the steadily dimming room, with the letter in front of him, and the photograph beside it, and the weight of 9 years of careful not knowing, sitting on his chest like something physical. He thought about the girl in the alley, the coat that was too large for her, the way she had looked at him without flinching, without asking for anything beyond what had already been promised, without performing anything at all, just looked at him, clear and direct and completely unaware of what she was looking at. He had asked Mrs. Alton to set the sitting room for 2 the next Tuesday, and he had gone downstairs and talked to the girl, and then he had come back up to his study and sat here with the drawer open, not quite able to make himself pick up the letter, for 3 hours, before he finally did it. He knew what he was going to do. He had known since the moment she said her name in the alley. He had just needed the 3 hours to finish arguing with himself about it. In the morning, he would send for his solicitor. He would tell the solicitor that he needed to locate a woman named Greta Voss, formerly of Mercer Hill, and determine the full circumstances of her arrangement with Lady Ashford 9 years prior. He would need every document that could be found. He would need to establish, with complete certainty, the identity of the child Greta Voss had been given to care for. Because Edmund Ashford was a careful man. He had been careful all his life, careful with his words and his feelings and his decisions, and being careful had cost him things, Clara, years, a daughter he had not known existed. He was not going to stop being careful now, but careful did not mean slow, and it did not mean cowardly. He folded the letter back into its envelope. He left the photograph on the desk. He went to bed and lay awake in the dark and listened to the house settle around him. the sounds of old stone and timber adjusting to the cold of the night, and he thought about a girl eating bread in an alley with perfect dignity and no idea at all of who she was. In the morning, when the gray light came through the curtains, he got up. He washed and dressed with the deliberate care he brought to everything. He went down to breakfast and ate it in the dining room, which was too large for one person, and had been too large for one person for 9 years, and he thought about what it would mean to have a child in this house. Not a guest. Not a visitor. A child. He had tried not to think about children after Clara died, because thinking about it had led nowhere useful. He was 60 now, with no heirs, and a house that would pass to his nephew Arthur upon his death, a fact that he had made his peace with years ago. Arthur was a capable enough young man who would manage the estate adequately. It had seemed like a sufficient ending. It no longer seemed sufficient. He sent the letter to his solicitor after breakfast. He wrote it himself rather than dictating it, which was unusual, and he wrote it very precisely, laying out exactly what was needed and why, without more detail than was necessary. The solicitor's name was Mr. Finch, and he arrived at the manor that same afternoon. He was a thin man with a very organized mind, and the ability to keep his expression neutral under any circumstances, which Edmund had always valued in him. Edmund told him as much as was needed. Not everything, not the texture of it, not the 9 years of the drawer and the photograph and the careful not knowing. Just the facts. Clara's letter, the arrangement with Greta Voss, the name Nadia Voss, the possibility, the likelihood, that the girl now attending the manor on Tuesdays and Thursdays was the daughter Clara had written of. Mr. Finch listened. He asked 3 precise questions. He wrote things in his small leather notebook. "I will begin immediately," he said. "The church records on Mercer Hill will have christening documents, if the child was registered there. The financial arrangement Lady Ashford described would leave some paper trail. A bank withdrawal of that size would be documented, and if Greta Voss is still in the city, she should not be difficult to find." "She may not be in the city," Edmund said. "The girl was put out 2 years ago. Greta Voss may have moved." Mr. Finch nodded. "I will find her regardless." He closed his notebook. "May I ask, my lord, does the girl know?" "No," Edmund said. "And you plan to tell her?" "When I am certain," Edmund said. "Not before." Mr. Finch nodded again and left. Edmund sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The house was quiet, in the way that large empty houses were quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but waiting, as though the rooms were holding their breath. He had lived in this quiet for 9 years, and he had made something livable of it, filling the space with work and duty and the steady management of the estate and its people. He had been a responsible owner and a fair employer and a generous donor to the causes of the district. He had been all the things a man of his position was expected to be. He had not been a father. He was not sure yet how to be one. He did not know whether Nadia would want him to be one, even if everything turned out to be what he believed it was. She was 12 years old and had been surviving on her own for 2 years, and children who had been surviving on their own for 2 years did not necessarily want someone coming along and telling them they had a father who had been in a large house all along. She might be angry. She had every right to be angry. He would deal with that if and when it came. First things had to come first, and the first thing was certainty. He went to the window and looked out at the garden, gray and spare in the November afternoon, the trees bare and the grass stiff with the approaching cold. Beyond the garden fence, the street was visible, and beyond the street, the city. Somewhere in that city, a girl with Clara's eyes was finding a place to spend the night. The thought was unacceptable. He rang for Mrs. Alton. She came in within a minute, which meant she had been nearby, which meant she had been anticipating being called. Mrs. Alton had run this house for 7 years, and there was very little that happened in it that she was not already aware of and already thinking about. "She will be coming back on Thursday," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Alton said. There was no question in her voice. "When she comes, I would like you to ask her whether there is anything she needs, practically. Clothing, shoes. I imagine she has little of either that is adequate for the winter." Mrs. Alton's expression shifted in a way that was very subtle, but that he had learned over 7 years to read. It was not quite emotion. It was more like recognition, the look of someone who has already been thinking exactly this. "I'll see to it," she said. Without making her feel like a charity case, he added, "Of course," Mrs. Alton said, with a very slight emphasis on the "of course," that conveyed quite clearly that she would never dream of doing anything else. She left. Edmund turned back to the window. He thought about Clara writing the letter. He thought about what it must have cost her. The careful words, the explanations, the apology. He thought about her leaving it with her solicitor, with the instruction that it be given to him only after she was gone. And he understood now, in a way he had not fully understood when he first read it 9 years ago, that the instruction was not carelessness or cowardice, but mercy. She had known that if he read it while she was still alive, while they were still building that careful new beginning together, it would have destroyed something. She had tried to protect what they had, even at the cost of what should have been. He could be angry about that. He had been angry about it, for a while, in the first year after her death, when the letter was new and the wound was open. But anger at the dead was a useless thing, and he had eventually let it go. What he could not let go, what he had been putting in a drawer for 9 years, was the obligation. Clara had asked him to find the child. He had not found her. He had told himself, very carefully and very reasonably, that it was not his responsibility. The child was being cared for. The arrangements were in place. There was no proof the child was his. But proof was what he had solicitors for. And the child had come to his gate. Some things were not coincidences. Edmund Ashford was not a sentimental man, and he did not believe in signs, but he believed in the weight of certain moments. He believed that when the world arranged itself in a particular way, it was sometimes asking you to do something you had been putting off. He had been putting this off for 9 years. He was not going to put it off any longer. He sat back down at his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He began to make a list of everything that needed to be done, not in order of convenience, but in order of importance. The legal questions came first. The practical questions came second. The question of how and when and what to say to a 12-year-old girl who had been eating bread in his alley for months without knowing any of this, that question came last on the list, but it was the one he kept coming back to. He would need to get it right. He had gotten a great many things wrong in his life, and he had lived with the consequences of them with as much grace as he could manage. But this was not something he was willing to get wrong. A child deserved truth, even when truth was complicated, especially when truth was complicated. He would find out everything first, and then he would tell her. He put the pen down and looked at the photograph of Clara, still sitting on the desk where he had left it the night before. She looked back at him, sideways, with that half-smile. He thought she would have approved of what he was doing. He thought she might have been glad that it was him doing it. He picked up the pen again and went on with his list. In a doorway across the city, Nadia tucked herself deeper into her coat and watched a cat pick its way along the top of a wall across the street, perfectly balanced, perfectly certain of where each paw was going. She envied cats sometimes. She thought about Thursday, about the sitting room with the fire and the tray of food, and the man who asked questions with his full attention, the way most people did not. She thought about his face when she had told him her mother's name was Clara. She turned the thought over, like she always did, examining each side. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew it was important. She pulled the coat tighter and closed her eyes, and the city went on around her, and the truth went on waiting, patient as it always was, for the right moment to come out. The church on Mercer Hill kept its records in a back room behind the vestry, in a wooden cabinet with brass fittings that was older than most of the people who had ever signed their names inside it. Mr. Finch arrived at 9 in the morning, 2 days after his meeting with Lord Ashford, with a letter of introduction from the solicitor's office and the particular manner of a man who expects cooperation and generally receives it. The vicar, a round-faced man in his 60s named Mr. Gould, led him to the cabinet without protest. He seemed to understand, in the way that men of his profession often understood, that certain questions needed answering, and that the church was a useful place for answering them. The christening record was there. Mr. Finch found it on the 3rd page of the register for that year, written in the careful hand of a different vicar, the previous one, who had since retired to the countryside. The entry read, Nadia Clara Voss, christened in this church on the 14th of March, daughter of Clara Voss, in the care of Greta Voss of number 12, Mercer Hill. Father, not entered. Mr. Finch sat for a moment looking at those 2 words. Not entered. It was a common enough notation for the time, when circumstances were complicated and no father was present to be registered. But it was also a gap, and gaps, in his experience, were where the most important things lived. He copied the entry into his notebook, thanked the vicar, and left. His next stop was the bank on Aldgate Street, where the financial records of the Ashford estate were held. He had prepared the necessary paperwork and had Lord Ashford's written authorization in his briefcase. The manager, a man named Mr. Crosby who wore extremely clean cuffs and had very tidy handwriting, took the authorization and the request, disappeared for 20 minutes, and returned with a ledger. The withdrawal was there. 9 years ago, made in the name of Lady Clara Ashford, in an amount that was substantial, but not so large as to be immediately unusual. Transferred to a bank draft made out to Greta Voss. Mr. Finch noted the date and the amount and the name. Then he went looking for Greta Voss. She was not on Mercer Hill. The family who now lived at number 12 had no knowledge of her. The neighbors on either side, an elderly couple in the one direction and a young family in the other, remembered a woman by that name living there some years ago, but neither could say exactly how many years, and neither had any idea where she had gone. Mr. Finch spent the better part of that day working through the district, moving in expanding circles from number 12, until a woman running a small tea shop on the corner of Hartley Lane recognized the name immediately. "Greta Voss," she said, without any particular warmth. "Yes, I remember her. Moved to Battersea about 3 years ago, I heard. Her sister lives there. Something happened with the girl she was supposed to be minding. The girl left, or was sent away, I wasn't sure which." She paused, wiping the counter. "What's this about?" "A legal matter," Mr. Finch said, which was both true and sufficient. He found Greta Voss in Battersea 2 days later. She lived in a narrow terraced house on a grey street, sharing it with her sister and the sister's husband, and she opened the door with the expression of someone who was not expecting visitors and was not particularly pleased to have them. She was perhaps 50, with iron grey hair and careful eyes that assessed Mr. Finch and his briefcase in the first 3 seconds. He told her who he represented. He told her why he was there. The careful eyes became very still. She let him in. They sat in the small front room, and Mr. Finch asked his questions clearly and without accusation, though the answers, as they emerged, were the kind that made accusation feel rather justified. Yes, she had taken the child. Lady Ashford had brought the child to her personally in the autumn of the year, and had paid her a sum of money for the child's care and upkeep, with the understanding that if Lady Ashford recovered her health, she would return for the child within a year. Lady Ashford had not come back within the year. Greta Voss had written to the Ashford estate once, at the beginning, and received no response. She did not know, or said she did not know, that Lady Ashford had in fact recovered, had reconciled with her husband, and had been living at the manor for several years before her death. She had spent the money. She said this simply, with the blankness of someone who has long since stopped expecting to be judged for something. She had spent the money on necessary things, she said, over the years. The cost of raising a child was considerable. Mr. Finch looked at his notebook. "You put the child out 2 years ago," he said. "She was 10 years old." Greta Voss did not answer immediately. "The money had run out," she said at last. "I had no income. My husband had died. I could not continue to maintain a child who was not mine." "She was 10 years old," Mr. Finch said again, quietly, without inflection. Greta Voss folded her hands in her lap and looked at the window. "I told the child to go to the parish," she said. "I told her there would be help there." "Did you contact the parish on her behalf?" Silence. "Did you contact the Ashford estate to inform them that the child was without care?" Silence. "Did you make any arrangement whatsoever for the child's welfare before you removed her from your household?" Greta Voss looked at him. Her face was not cruel. That was the thing that struck Mr. Finch, sitting in that grey front room with the sound of the street outside. She did not look like a cruel woman. She looked like someone who had made choices that she had never fully looked at, because looking at them would have been uncomfortable. "I did what I could," she said. Mr. Finch closed his notebook. He thanked her for her time, in the precise and neutral tones of his profession, and he left. He sat in the cab on the way back across the city and wrote up his notes in full, including Greta Voss's answers and the long silences that had stood in for several of them. He wrote down the christening record details, and the bank record, and the testimony of the tea shop woman on Hartley Lane, and the address on Mercer Hill. He wrote it all out in his careful hand, and then he looked at what he had written, and he understood, with complete clarity, what it added up to. When he arrived at Ashford Manor that afternoon, he laid everything in front of Lord Ashford, and went through it piece by piece. Edmund listened without interrupting. His face was composed and still, and gave nothing away, except that his right hand, resting on the arm of his chair, gripped the wood slightly harder when Mr. Finch described the conversation with Greta Voss. When it was done, Edmund was quiet for a moment. "The christening record does not name the father," Mr. Finch said carefully. "No," Edmund agreed. "There is more to be done. A medical examination to confirm her age. Testimony from the midwife who attended Lady Ashford's lying-in, if she can be found. The letter you hold is important, but it is not in itself legally sufficient to establish paternity without additional evidence." "I understand," Edmund said. "Do everything that is needed. It will take some time." "Take the time," Edmund said. "Do it properly." Mr. Finch nodded and gathered his papers. At the door he paused. "The girl," he said. "Nadia, she is still coming here?" "On Tuesdays and Thursdays," Edmund said. "Does she know yet what is being investigated?" "No." Mr. Finch considered this. He was a man of law, and not of feeling, as a rule. But there were moments when the two overlapped, and this was one of them. "She has managed remarkably," he said. 2 years on her own, at that age. "Yes," Edmund said. He looked at the window. "She has." Mr. Finch left. Edmund sat in the quiet of his study, with the afternoon light fading, and thought about the facts, as he now knew them. The money, the christening record, the woman in Battersea, with her careful eyes and her long silences, the 10-year-old child standing in a doorway and being told to go to the parish. He thought about Nadia on Thursday, sitting in the fireside chair with her straight back and her hands folded in her lap, eating with careful precision, answering his questions with a directness that he found remarkable in anyone, let alone a child. He had been testing, gently, over the past 2 Thursdays, how much she knew of her own past. She knew very little. She knew the name Clara and the name Greta, and she knew that she was alone. She did not know that alone was something that had been done to her, not something she had been born to. He was going to have to tell her. Not yet. There were still things to confirm. There were still pieces to fit together before he could give her something solid enough to hold on to. He would not give her a maybe. He would not build something uncertain under her feet. She had been living on uncertain ground for 2 years, and she deserved something that was sure. But he was going to tell her. He went to the window. The street below was quiet in the late afternoon, the lamps not yet lit, the sky above the rooftops turning a cold, deep blue at the edges. He thought about Clara writing the letter. He thought about what it must have cost her to write the words, to lay out the things she had not been able to say, knowing she would not be there to explain them, knowing that the explanation itself was imperfect, that no words on a page could fully carry the weight of a decision made in fear, and love, and desperation, and then lived with for years in silence. He had spent a long time being angry at the silence. He was not angry anymore. He was tired of being angry at people who were gone. What he wanted now was to do the thing that should have been done, not because it would fix what had gone wrong, because nothing would fix what had gone wrong, but because the girl sitting in that chair on Thursdays was real, and she was here, and she had come to his gate without knowing why, the way some people walk toward things they need, without being able to name the need. He was not going to let her walk away again. Across the city, in the late afternoon, Nadia was helping Geoffrey stack crates at the market, moving quickly in the cold, her breath coming out in short white puffs. She worked without speaking much, which Geoffrey had come to appreciate. He was not a talkative man himself, and he liked that she worked with her whole attention, not half of it, on something else. When they were done, he handed her a coin and 2 pairs. "Cold coming in tonight," he said, looking at the sky. "Find somewhere covered." "I will," she said. She put the pairs in her pocket and the coin in the knotted cloth inside her coat lining and walked away through the market, threading between the remaining stalls, her mind moving over the practical questions of the evening, the way it always moved over them: where to sleep, what she still had to eat, how cold it was going to get. But underneath the practical questions, in the quieter part of her mind, something else was running. She thought about Lord Ashford's questions. He had asked her about Greta Voss, not by name, but by description. He had asked what she could tell him about the woman who had cared for her. He had asked it casually, as though it were simply part of learning who she was. But Nadia had been living by her wits for 2 years, and she could tell when a question was casual, and when a question was pointed. The question had been pointed. She did not know why. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned everything over, methodically, without rushing to a conclusion, checking each side before deciding what to think. He was looking into something. She was sure of that. The questions were not random. They were building towards something, piece by piece, in the way that structures were built, starting with the base and working upward, each piece placed before the next one could go on. She did not know what the structure was, but she knew she was part of it. The thought was not frightening, exactly. It was more like standing at the edge of something large and not being able to see where it ended. She had stood at the edges of large things before, and they had mostly turned out badly, which was a reasonable basis for caution. But this felt different. This felt like the edge of something that might go up, rather than down. She found her doorway before dark, and ate one of the pears and a piece of bread she had saved from Thursday's meal. And she lay back in her coat, and looked at the strip of sky above the rooftops, and listened to the city moving around her. She thought about the christening record she did not know existed, in the church on Mercer Hill, with her name written in someone else's careful hand. She thought about the letter she had never seen, on a desk in a study she had never been in, with the words that would change everything already written in the handwriting of a woman she did not know was her mother. She did not think about these things because she did not know about them. She only thought about Thursday, and about what might be being built, piece by piece, one careful question at a time. Greta Voss was not a villain. That was the thing that made it worse. She was simply a woman who had made one decision, that had led to another decision, and then another, the way bad decisions so often worked, each one smaller than the last, each one a little easier to explain to herself, until the accumulation of all of them was something that could not be explained at all. This was not something that Nadia knew. Nadia had almost no information about Greta Voss, because she had stopped thinking about Greta Voss on the second day after she was put out of the house on Mercer Hill. Not because she was not angry, she was, but because anger at someone who was gone was a weight she could not afford to carry. She had too many other things to carry. What Nadia knew about the 2 years between the house on Mercer Hill and the gate of Ashford Manor was simple and practical. She knew how to find food in a city that was not looking for her, how to stay warm in November without a bed, how to be present in public spaces in a way that did not make people want to remove her from them. She had learned these things the way you learn to walk, by falling, repeatedly, and getting up and adjusting until the balance was right. She had fallen quite a few times in the beginning. The first week she had gone to the parish, as Greta had told her to, and she had spent 3 days in the parish hall, on a cot between a very old man who coughed all night and a woman who cried very quietly and regularly in the darkness. The food was adequate. The rules were many. She had left on the 4th day, not because the rules were impossible, but because the atmosphere was one of being processed rather than being helped, and something in her had known, at 10 years old, that if she let herself be processed, she might never come out the other side as herself. She was not sure where that knowledge came from. She had walked out of the parish hall in the early morning and had stood on the street and looked at the city and made a decision that she would manage on her own, and she had spent the next week going very hungry and sleeping in places that were not sheltered enough and making every mistake that could be made by a 10-year-old girl who had never been on her own. And then she had met Jeffrey. Not by design. She had been helping an older woman carry her market bags up a steep street. One of the things she had figured out, in those first weeks, was that helping people was more reliable than asking people. That if you made yourself useful, you were more likely to be treated as a person. And the woman had stopped at Jeffrey's stall and introduced Nadia as the girl who had helped her up the hill. And Jeffrey had looked at Nadia for a moment, with the assessing look of someone who was deciding whether to get involved in something that was not their business. He had gotten involved. Not dramatically, not with speeches or gestures. He had simply told her to come back the next morning if she wanted to help stack crates, and he would give her something for it. She had come back. That had been the beginning. Over the following months, through Jeffrey and through the other small networks that developed naturally when you were the kind of person who showed up and worked and did not cause trouble. Nadia had built a life that was precarious by most standards, but that felt, to her, like something she had made herself. Something that was hers. She had Sister Agnes on Monday and Wednesday mornings. She had Jeffrey's Market on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She had the cold meat delivery that ran past the corner of Aldgate Street every Friday, where a delivery man named Leonard had given her a small portion of whatever was left over at the end of his round for the past 8 months, ever since she had helped him retrieve a package that had slid under a cart and was being eyed by a stray dog. She had the gate at Ashford Manor on Tuesday evenings. She had her doorway in the deep-set entrance of the bookshop, where the owner, a thin man named Mr. Harvey who wore round spectacles and always smelled slightly of old paper, had come out one morning 6 months ago and looked at her bundled in her coat and gone back inside without saying anything, and then come back out with a cup of tea and set it on the step beside her and gone back in again. He had done this every morning since, when he opened the shop. They had never discussed it. She suspected they never would. This was her city. These were her people, not family, not in any formal sense, but the particular constellation of individuals who had made room for her, in their small ways, and she had learned the shape of each of their small ways, the way you learned the layout of a room you lived in. And now, alongside all of this, was Thursday. Thursday had become something she thought about before the other days of the week. Not because of the food, though the food was good and substantial and warmed her from the inside in a way that street food did not always do. She thought about Thursday because of the questions. Lord Ashford asked the best questions she had ever encountered. Not invasive questions, not questions that tried to strip things away from her. Questions that were more like extensions, as though he were interested in the shape of her thinking, in how she arrived at things, in what she noticed about the world around her. He had asked her once what the hardest thing was about being on her own. She had thought about it for a full minute before answering. The waiting, she had said, not knowing when the next thing is going to happen. Most people know roughly what the next hour will look like. I don't always. He had looked at her with an expression she had not been able to name. Not pity. She was very good at recognizing pity and avoiding the situations that produced it. Something older than pity. Something that had something to do with time. That is a very clear way of putting it, he had said. Another time he had asked her what she liked to do, not what she did to survive, but what she liked. She had been caught off guard by that one. No one asked her what she liked. She had thought about it and said, reading. I like reading. He had asked what she read, and she had explained about the salvaged pages, how she collected whatever fragments of text she came across in the street, pages that had fallen from books or been used as wrapping paper, or been discarded from pamphlets, and how she read them wherever she could find the light to do it, even when they were only a page or two, and had no beginning and no end, just the middle of something she would never know the whole of. He had looked at her for a long moment. The next Thursday, there had been 3 books on the table in the sitting room, beside the tea tray, not presented dramatically, just there, as if they had always been there. She had looked at them, and then at him. Mrs. Alton found them in the library, he said, with the same ease he brought to everything. I thought you might find them useful. She had taken them home in the cloth parcel Mrs. Alton always packed for her. She had read the first one in 3 days, sitting in doorways and under market awnings, and wherever the light was good enough to see. She had thought, while reading it, that someone had paid attention to her, had listened to a thing she said, and then done something about it. It was such a small action, 3 books from a library. It had cost him nothing, but it had sat in her chest all week like something warm. She was thinking about this on the Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Mr. Finch's visit to Battersea, walking through the early streets toward the market, when she turned a corner and nearly walked into a man she did not know. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with a round face and an irritated expression that was directed at the street in general and redirected at her when she appeared around the corner. "Watch where you're going," he said sharply. "Sorry," she said, stepping to the side. She had learned very early not to argue with irritated men on street corners. He walked on without looking at her again. She thought nothing more about it. She did not know that the man's name was Arthur Cranwell, and that he was Lord Ashford's nephew, and that he had been walking from the solicitor's office on the next street, where he had just been told, by a colleague of Mr. Finch's who should not have said anything, that Lord Ashford was pursuing some kind of inquiry into a possible heir. She did not know any of this. She only knew he had been irritated and she had stepped out of his way. She went on to the market and spent the morning with Geoffrey, who was in good spirits because a new supply of apples had come in from the country, and they were the best he had seen all autumn. He let her eat one while they worked, which was unusual, and indicated he was in very good spirits indeed. She ate the apple and stacked the crates and thought about Thursday evening. When she arrived at the manor that afternoon, Mrs. Alton let her in as usual, and led her to the sitting room as usual, and everything was the same as it always was: the fire, the tray, the 2 chairs, except that Lord Ashford was not in the chair across from her when she sat down. He came in a few minutes later, slightly later than usual, with a look on his face that she could not immediately read. He sat down. He asked about her week. She told him about the apple supply and Geoffrey's good mood. He smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that changed his whole face for a moment and made him look younger. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Nadia," he said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that you may answer it or not as you choose. There is no wrong answer." She set her cup down. "I would like to know whether your aunt, Greta Voss, ever told you anything about where she came from in relation to you, whether she was a relation of your mother's or your father's, or how she came to be the one caring for you." Nadia thought about this carefully. "She told me she was my mother's cousin," she said, "on my mother's side. She said my mother had no other family. She said my father was never in the picture." She paused. That was how she put it. Never in the picture. Edmund was looking at her with the careful attention he always gave her answers. "She never mentioned the name Ashford to you?" he asked. "In any context?" Nadia's chest made a small, distinct movement. She looked at him. The fire in the grate was the same fire. The tea in her cup was the same tea. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been a moment before. And yet something had changed. She could feel it, the way you could feel a shift in the air before thunder. "No," she said. "She never mentioned that name." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and she was glad of that, because her face was doing things she was not sure she had control of. Ashford. He had said the name as though she might recognize it, as though it might mean something to her personally, not just as the name on the gate of this house. She looked at him. He turned from the fire and looked back at her, and there was something in his face that was different from all the other Thursdays. The door that she had noticed behind his expression, the one that opened a crack and closed, it was open wider now, and behind it, she could see something that was not just searching or careful or serious. It was something that looked like it had been waiting for a very long time. "There are some things I need to tell you," he said. She folded her hands in her lap. "All right," she said. She said it the same way she had said things on every Thursday in this room, quietly, without showing more than she meant to show. But inside the coat, she was not quite as still as she appeared. Inside the coat, her hands were pressed together very hard. She sat straight in her chair, and she listened. And the truth, which had been patient for so long, began, very carefully, to come out. 3 miles across the city, at almost exactly the same hour that Nadia sat in the sitting room of Ashford Manor with her hands pressed together in her lap, a man was sitting in a different kind of room, smaller, darker, with none of the warmth, and having a very different kind of conversation. Arthur Cranwell was 34 years old, and had been the presumed heir to the Ashford estate for as long as he could remember. He had not been presumed by anyone in particular. No document existed making him such. No conversation had been had in which his uncle had explicitly told him that the estate would pass to him. It was simply understood. Edmund had no children. His wife Clara was gone. He was 60 years old with no prospect of a second marriage. Arthur was the nearest male relation. The estate would come to Arthur. This had been the understanding for 9 years, and Arthur had built a great deal of his life around it. Not in a shameful way, he told himself. Not in the way of a man sitting around waiting for someone to die, but in the practical way of a man who knows that certain resources are eventually going to be available to him and who makes his plans accordingly. He had borrowed somewhat freely on the strength of expectations that were reasonable and widely understood. He had made investments that were not entirely sound, but that he had expected to be able to absorb in the fullness of time. The news from the solicitor's colleague, second-hand, informal, the sort of intelligence that came through the particular network of professional relationships that existed in the legal world, was that Lord Ashford had engaged Mr. Finch to investigate the existence of an heir. Arthur had gone home from the solicitor's office and sat in his front room for an hour, not doing anything, just sitting. Then he had written a letter to his own solicitor, a man named Mr. Holt, asking him to come at the earliest opportunity. Mr. Holt arrived the following morning. He was a different kind of solicitor from Mr. Finch, less precise, more flexible, better at finding the soft places in situations. Arthur told him what he had heard. Mr. Holt listened, and then asked the practical questions. Who was the claimed heir? What was the basis for the claim? What stage was the investigation at? Arthur could not answer most of these questions. He had very little information beyond the bare fact that an inquiry existed. Find out more, Arthur said, discreetly. Mr. Holt said he would see what he could learn. After he left, Arthur sat for a while longer in his front room. He tried to examine himself honestly. He was a reasonable man, he thought. He was not the kind of person who would do something unconscionable. If his uncle had a legitimate child, if there really was a child, a real heir, properly documented, then of course that would change things. He would not stand in the way of what was right. But he needed to know whether it was right. He needed to know exactly what was being claimed and on what evidence, and he needed to know before it became public, before it went before a court or a body of law, before it acquired the momentum that such things acquired once they were set in motion. Information was not obstruction. Knowing what was happening was not the same as opposing it. He told himself this several times over the course of the afternoon. What he did not tell himself, because it was the kind of thought that was easier not to look at directly, was that the investigation itself frightened him, not because it was probably wrong, but because it might be right. He went about his evening and did not think about it further. But in the morning, he thought about it again, and in the morning after that. And on the Tuesday of the following week, when Mr. Holt came back with more information, that the subject of the inquiry was a girl of approximately 12 years of age, named Nadia, living without fixed residence in the city, apparently being brought to the manor on a regular basis by arrangement with Lord Ashford. Something tightened in Arthur's chest that he could not entirely explain away. A homeless girl, coming to the manor twice a week. He thought about this very carefully. She was a child. Whatever she was or was not, she was a 12-year-old child living on the streets of the city, and that fact sat uncomfortably in him alongside everything else. He was not going to do anything to harm a child. He was simply going to protect his position. Those two things were not in conflict, he told himself. They were absolutely not in conflict. Nadia did not hear most of what Lord Ashford told her that Thursday evening on the first attempt. Not because she was not paying attention. She paid attention to everything, always. It was because about 40 seconds into what he was saying, when he got to the part about Clara Ashford, née Voss, who was my wife, something in Nadia's hearing went briefly strange, like when you went from a very quiet room into a very loud street, and the sounds did not quite resolve properly for a moment. She made herself breathe. She made herself sit still, which was what she always did when the ground moved underneath her, which was not very often, because she had learned to stand on uncertain ground. But this was a different kind of movement. This was not the ground shifting. This was the ground being pulled back to reveal that what she had been standing on was not the ground at all. She breathed. She listened. He told her about Clara's letter. He did not read it to her. He told her what it said, carefully, in plain language, without softening things in a way that would make them unclear, and without telling her more than she needed right now. He told her that Clara had been ill, that she had made a decision out of fear, that she had left money and arrangements, that she had intended to come back. He told her that Clara had died before she could come back. He told her that he had found the letter after Clara's death, and that he had not. He paused here, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly, that he had not acted on it as he should have. He said this without making excuses. He simply said it as a fact about himself, something that had been true, that he was telling her because she deserved the truth. She looked at him. He met her gaze without looking away. She thought about the drawer. She had not known about the drawer, but she could imagine it. A man opening a letter and reading something that turned the world sideways, and then putting it somewhere he did not have to look at it. Because there are things that are too large to carry in the ordinary way, and sometimes you put them down, and sometimes the putting down becomes its own kind of habit. She did not say this. She did not say anything. He told her that his solicitor had been investigating for the past several weeks. He told her what Mr. Finch had found: the christening record, the bank draft to Greta Voss, the visit to Battersea. He told her that there was still more to confirm, that he was being careful, because she deserved certainty, and not just probability, but that what had been found so far pointed in a very clear direction. He stopped. The room was quiet. The fire in the grate was very regular and steady, and the sound of it was something to hold on to. "The direction," Nadia said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "What direction?" Edmund looked at her. "That you are my daughter," he said. It was a very simple sentence. She looked at the fire. She thought about her mother's name being Clara. She had always known her mother's name was Clara. Greta had told her that much, in the brief and uncomfortable conversations that were the closest Greta came to discussing her family. Clara. Just Clara. Clara Ashford. She thought about the photograph she had not yet seen. She thought about eyes, and what it meant to have someone else's eyes, and how you would never know unless someone put a picture in front of you. She thought about the gate. She thought about the bread. She thought about the fact that she had been coming to this gate for 8 months, through all weathers, and eating the bread from this kitchen, and standing outside these iron bars, and she had not known, had not had any idea, that the man inside the house might be looking out a study window at her, without knowing either, and that somewhere between them was a truth that was waiting to be found, the way lost things are sometimes just waiting. She looked at him. His face was open. It was the only word she could get to. All the careful, composed control was still there, the way a strong structure is still there even when you can see through the gaps in it. But behind it, everything was open, and it was pointed at her, and it was the most undefended she had ever seen another human being look. She thought about what she felt. It was not simple. It was not one thing. She had known, in the general way that you came to know things by listening to the city around you, that Lord Ashford had been a widower for many years and had no children. She had not known what his wife's name was. She had not known what Clara's last name was. She had not known, she had not thought, she had not imagined. She put these thoughts aside. "What happens now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, as though he had expected a different first question. "My solicitor will complete the investigation," he said. "When he has everything he needs, there will be a formal process for recognizing your identity. It may take some time. There are legal requirements." She nodded. "In the meantime," he said, and he paused, and she could see him choosing his words very carefully. "I would like you to come and stay here, in the house, not as a guest, as my daughter, if you are willing." She looked at him. She thought about the bookshop doorway, which was sheltered and dry, and as close as she had to a home. She thought about the fact that she had been living with less than was survivable, by most people's standards, and that she had survived it anyway, and that survival was something she was very good at, and also something she was extraordinarily tired of. She thought about the way he had asked, with willing at the end, as though her willingness was a real thing that mattered. "I would like that," she said. He nodded once, with the same economy he brought to everything. He did not say anything dramatic. He did not appear to need to. Mrs. Alton appeared in the doorway a moment later, as though she had been nearby, which Nadia strongly suspected she had been. "I've had the guest room on the second floor prepared," Mrs. Alton said. "If you'd like to see it this evening, I can take you up." Nadia looked at Mrs. Alton. She looked at Lord Ashford. She looked at the fire. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She stood. She smoothed her coat, which was too large and worn, and smelled of the city. She tucked the cloth parcel under her arm, the one Mrs. Alton had always packed for her, the habit of assuming she would go back out, and then stopped. She looked at the parcel. Then she looked at Mrs. Alton. "I don't think I'll need this tonight," she said. Mrs. Alton took the parcel from her with the same composed, unhurried manner she brought to everything, but Nadia saw something change in her eyes, just briefly, just a flash of something warm, before it was tucked back out of sight. "No," Mrs. Alton said. "I don't suppose you will." She led Nadia out of the sitting room and up the stairs. Behind them, Lord Ashford sat for a moment longer in his chair by the fire. He looked at the empty chair across from him. He looked at the 2 teacups on the tray. He looked at the photograph of Clara, which he had brought down from his study and set on the mantelpiece that morning, without quite deciding to, and which had been looking out at the room all evening from its small oval frame. He did not say anything to the photograph, but he looked at it for a long time. And then he stood and straightened his coat and went to see about the practical arrangements that needed making, because there was a child in this house now, and practical arrangements were what was needed, and practical arrangements were what he was good at. The guest room on the 2nd floor was a very good room. It had a proper bed, with clean linens, and a window that looked out over the garden. Nadia stood in the middle of it, and looked at the bed, and the window, and the small table with a lamp on it, and then she sat down on the edge of the bed, carefully, and put her hands in her lap. The mattress was very soft. She sat on it for a moment, feeling the softness under her, and something in her that had been held very tight for a very long time loosened one notch. Just one. She was not going to let go of all of it at once. She had learned, very well, that things could change again. That warm rooms and kind people were not permanent just because they felt that way. She had learned to be glad of good things without depending on them, because depending on things made losing them worse. But she sat on the edge of the bed and felt the mattress under her, and she thought that she would allow herself one notch. Outside the window, the city moved through the night. Carts and footsteps and distant voices, the same sounds she had fallen asleep to for 2 years, from much closer and much colder. She took off her coat. She hung it on the back of the chair by the table. She lay down on top of the blankets and looked at the ceiling and thought about a woman named Clara who had been afraid and had loved her and had left her a name and nothing else, and about a man downstairs who had been careful for too long and was, finally, trying to stop being careful in the particular way that had cost him everything. She thought about the bread at the gate. She thought about the fact that she had been coming to this house for months, in the cold and the dark, for a piece of bread that somebody inside the house had not eaten. She thought about how close things could be, and how long it could take to find them. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep without listening for anything. Morning in Ashford Manor was different from morning on the street. Nadia had expected this. She had known, obviously, that mornings inside were different from mornings outside. She had lived inside before, with Greta, and before Greta, in places she only partly remembered. The early childhood of a girl who had been moved around enough that individual houses blurred into a general sense of roofs and other people's things. But she had forgotten, over 2 years, some of the specific textures of it. The light was different. It came through the window at an angle she had not experienced in a long time, falling across the foot of the bed, in a way that said the room faced east, and the sun was up, and the world outside was moving, but she was not in it yet, and did not have to be. She lay still for a moment and registered this. Then she got up, because lying still was not something she was good at. Her body had been trained, over 2 years, to be up and moving as soon as consciousness arrived, and the training did not stop just because the situation had changed. She was dressed and standing at the window looking down at the garden when a knock came at the door. "Come in," she said. Mrs. Alton opened the door with the same composed expression she brought to everything. She was carrying a tray. "Good morning," she said. "I wasn't sure whether you'd come down or prefer to have breakfast here while you settle in." Nadia looked at the tray. Toast, a soft-boiled egg, a small pot of tea, a glass of water. "I can come downstairs," she said. "You're welcome to stay up here if you prefer," Mrs. Alton said, setting the tray on the small table. "There's no right answer." Nadia sat down at the table. She looked at the egg, which had been precisely timed and placed in a small china cup with a spoon beside it. She thought about the fact that someone had timed an egg for her. She thought about the boiling water and the minutes counted and the cup carried up the stairs. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she always said it, clearly, meaning it. Mrs. Alton nodded and left. Nadia ate the breakfast slowly, looking at the garden below. A man she had not seen before was working in the far corner among the bare rose bushes, wearing a heavy apron. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knew exactly what needed doing, and was doing it without being watched. She liked that. She drank the tea and thought about what came next. She had a room. She had a bed. She had been told she was someone's daughter, pending confirmation. These were very large facts, and she had, overnight, placed them in the part of her mind where she put things that were important, but not yet fully understood. A kind of holding space she had developed over 2 years of situations that needed to be lived with before they could be fully thought about. What she needed now was to understand the structure of the days here. She could not exist in a place without understanding its structure. That had been true, even on the street. The whole system of Geoffrey and Sister Agnes and Leonard and the gate and the Tuesday bread had been a structure she built herself. Because without structure, you drifted, and when you drifted, you got cold and hungry and frightened. She needed to know what time meals were. She needed to know what spaces in the house she was meant to use and what spaces were not for her. She needed to know what she was supposed to do with the hours of the day that were not eating or sleeping. She thought about the library he had mentioned when he brought the books. Mrs. Alton had said it was where the books came from. After breakfast, she went downstairs. Lord Ashford was in the dining room, which was large and paneled, and had a table that could have seated 12, eating breakfast at one end of it. He looked up when she came in. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He gestured at the chair closest to him, which had a place setting at it. She sat. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Very well," she said. He nodded. He was not looking at her with the complicated weight of the previous evening. He was looking at her with something quieter, something that was still figuring itself out. She thought that was reasonable. She was still figuring herself out too. "I thought today," he said, after a moment, "we might simply go through the house, so that you know where things are, and what is where. There are no rules about what you may or may not use. I would like you to feel that this is your home. I understand that may take some time." She thought about home. She thought about the word and what it meant to her, which was mostly the absence of it, the fact of being somewhere that was not yours, of existing on surfaces that belonged to other people, of sleeping in places that would not hold you. "That would be useful," she said. "The house tour." He almost smiled. "Yes, after breakfast." They ate in a companionable silence that was more comfortable than it had any right to be, given that they had known each other for 3 weeks and had told each other one enormous truth the previous evening. But she thought that he was probably, like her, a person who was comfortable with silence, that some people found silence something to be filled urgently, and other people found it simply a space, and she and Lord Ashford were both the second kind. He showed her the house after breakfast. He was methodical and clear, showing her each room without commentary beyond what was necessary. "This is the library. These shelves are not organized as well as they should be. Feel free to use any of the books. This is the sitting room you have already used. This is the conservatory, which is warmer in the afternoon. This is the study, which is where I work in the evenings. This is the kitchen. Mrs. Alton will be glad to arrange meals at whatever time suit you." She walked through the rooms with him, and noted each one the way she noted all spaces, their exits, their light, their particular qualities of warmth and sound. The library was the room that made her stop. It was not enormous, by the standards of what she imagined libraries could be. It was a medium-sized room, lined on 3 walls, with shelves from floor to ceiling, with 2 deep chairs by the window, and a standing lamp between them, and a low table and a reading stand that could be adjusted to any height. The 4th wall had a fireplace with a mantelpiece and another small shelf on top of it. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. She thought about the salvaged pages, the torn edges, the missing beginnings and endings, the middles of things she had never known the whole of. "You may spend as much time in here as you like," Edmund said, from just behind her. She nodded. She could not immediately speak, which was unusual for her. She walked in and ran one finger along a row of spines and thought about what it meant to be able to do that, to be able to reach out and take any of these things from their places and read them, not pages, but whole books, beginnings and middles and ends. She thought that was perhaps the most extraordinary thing that had happened yet. She turned around. "Thank you," she said. He was standing in the doorway with his hands behind his back, and there was something on his face that she was starting to learn, a look that was not quite a smile, but was the emotion that occurred before a smile. The decision to let something show. "Of course," he said. She pulled a book from the shelf and carried it to one of the chairs by the window. She sat down. He watched her for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I'll be in my study, if you need anything." She was already reading. He went to his study. Downstairs, Mrs. Alton was speaking with the cook about adjusting the meal schedule to accommodate a child in the house, and the cook was nodding, in the efficient way of someone who has simply been waiting to be told that this was what was needed. The man in the garden was still working among the rose bushes. The city moved beyond the iron fence, and inside the fence things were different from how they had been yesterday. Different in ways that were large and obvious, and also in ways that were small and not yet nameable. In the library, Nadia turned a page. She was reading the beginning of something, a real beginning, with a first line and everything that came after it in the order it was meant to be read. She thought she might feel very strongly about that for a moment, and then she steadied herself and went on. She went on reading. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day Mr. Holt had arranged for it to arrive, which was 3 days before the Thursday on which Arthur Cranwell had planned to come to the manor for what he described to himself as a family visit, and what was in fact a reconnaissance. The letter was addressed to Lord Ashford, and was written with the careful neutrality of language that had been chosen to say several things, while appearing to say only one. It expressed Arthur's concern, as a family member, as someone who had always respected and admired his uncle, as someone who had the family's best interests at heart, about recent events that had come to his attention through various channels. It said that he hoped his uncle was in good health, and that he looked forward to calling on him at his earliest convenience. It said that he understood there had been some changes at the manor of late, and that he hoped they were going forward in the appropriate manner, with appropriate advice from appropriate legal counsel. The letter was, in the particular way of carefully written letters, a warning. Edmund read it twice at his desk that morning. Then he put it aside and looked out the window. The garden was visible from his study, and Nadia was in it. She had discovered the garden 3 days after moving in, on a cold, bright morning, when she had simply appeared at the back door in her coat, her own coat now, which was a new one that Mrs. Alton had quietly arranged, dark blue wool that fit her properly and had deep pockets, and gone out and walked slowly along the paths between the bare beds, looking at everything with the careful attention she gave to everything she encountered. She was in the garden most mornings now, in the hour before she went to the library. The gardener, a quietly spoken man named Mr. Webb, had begun talking to her about the plants, what they were, and when they would come back in the spring, and she listened to him with the same focused attention she gave to everything, and she had already begun to ask questions that Mr. Webb, from what Mrs. Alton reported, found increasingly impressive. Edmund watched her now, walking along the path with her hands in her pockets, stopping to crouch down by something near the ground, her head bent over it. He picked up Arthur's letter again. He was not afraid of Arthur. He was not unaware that Arthur had an interest in the estate's succession, and he was not naive about the fact that the news of Nadia's existence would not be welcome in that quarter. Arthur was not a bad person. He was a person with a great deal invested in a particular outcome, which was a circumstance that made even good people do things they would not otherwise do. Edmund was going to have to speak to him. He would do it after the legal process was further along, when he had more certainty, more documentation, more of the solid ground that Nadia deserved to stand on, before anyone began to challenge it. He put the letter in a different drawer, and went to his desk, and picked up his pen. He wrote a reply to Arthur that was, in its own careful way, an acknowledgement. He acknowledged the letter. He expressed his own good wishes for Arthur's health. He said he looked forward to Arthur's visit at the end of the month, which was the date he named, not the following Thursday but the end of the month, buying himself the time he needed. He sealed the letter and rang for it to be sent. Then he sat back and thought about Nadia, crouching in the garden in her new coat, looking at something near the ground with complete attention. He thought about what it was going to take to protect her. Not from Arthur specifically. Arthur was a complication, not a threat. The law did not bend for nephews with presumed expectations, and if the case was solid, the case was solid. He was not worried about Arthur in that way. He was thinking about something larger, something that had been forming in his thinking over the past 2 weeks, as he watched Nadia move through the house and begin to occupy it, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, Then with the quiet authority of someone who is learning that they are allowed to be somewhere. She had been told that she was probably his daughter. She did not yet know what that meant, practically, legally, in the full sense of how the world worked. She knew she had a room, and meals, and a library. She did not yet know about inheritance, or estates, or the particular complications of being the child of a man with property and position, and a family history that included, apparently, a nephew who was going to be very unhappy. He was going to need to tell her more. He was going to need to tell her, at some point, that the thing she had come into was not simple, that it was going to require something of her, that there were people who would not want her here. He was going to need to tell her that in a way that did not frighten her, or make her feel that her place here was conditional, because it was not conditional, but she would need to know the shape of what was coming. He had been managing the timing of information very carefully. He knew that. He had been giving her things in pieces, because the whole of it at once was too large. The mother, the letter, the years, the legal process, the house, all of it at once was too much for anyone, and she was 12. But she was also the most capable 12-year-old he had ever encountered, and he thought she was probably ready for more than he had told her. He decided to tell her about Arthur. Not everything. Not the letter's undertone. Not the specific financial motivations. Not the full complexity of what might come if Arthur decided to pursue his challenge aggressively. Just the fact that his nephew existed, that his nephew had expected to inherit, that his nephew knew Nadia was here. He went to find her. She was still in the garden, talking to Mr. Webb now, who was showing her something with a small trowel. She looked up when Edmund came along the path. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning. May I walk with you for a moment?" Mr. Webb tactfully found something that needed doing in the opposite direction. They walked along the garden path, Nadia matching his longer steps with the easy adjustment of someone who was accustomed to moving alongside people much larger than herself. He told her about Arthur. He kept it factual and clear, the way he kept most things with her, because he had learned that she responded better to facts than to softened versions of facts. He told her that Arthur was his sister's son, that he lived in the city, that he had for some time understood himself to be the likely heir of the estate, and that the news of Nadia's investigation had almost certainly reached him. Nadia listened to all of this without stopping walking. "He's going to cause trouble," she said, when he had finished. It was not a question. "He may," Edmund said. "I don't know yet what form that will take. He's written a letter that says nothing directly, but the letter is the kind of letter that says a great deal by not saying it." Nadia nodded slowly. "What does he want?" she asked. "Specifically, what would the best outcome be for him?" Edmund looked at her sideways. "He would prefer," he said, carefully, "that the investigation not conclude in the way it is likely to conclude." She considered this. The path took a small turn around a stone urn, and she went around it with the same ease she went around everything. "Can he prevent it?" she asked. "He can challenge it. Legally. If he engages a solicitor and mounts a formal challenge to my recognition of you as my heir, that would require a response. It would take time. It would be unpleasant. But not necessarily successful," she said. "If the evidence supports what we believe it supports, then no, not necessarily successful." She stopped walking. She turned and looked up at him, with that direct look she had, the one that felt like being assessed by someone who was used to making fast and accurate assessments. "Will it?" she asked. "The evidence." He looked at her. "I believe so," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "All right," she said. She started walking again. He walked beside her in the cold morning air, and the garden went on around them, stripped bare and patient, waiting for the spring. "You're not frightened," he said. She seemed to consider whether this was true. "I've been frightened before," she said, "real frightened. The kind where you don't know where you're sleeping, or whether you'll be warm enough, or who you can trust. This doesn't feel like that kind." He thought about that. "What kind does it feel like?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The kind where something is difficult, but there's a reason to get through it," she said. "That's a different feeling. It's better." He thought that was one of the most precise descriptions of the difference between dread and challenge he had ever heard from anyone, and he had known a great many adults who could not have made that distinction so clearly. He said nothing. He simply walked beside her. The garden was quiet around them. The city hummed beyond the fence, and somewhere in a set of offices across the city, Mr. Finch was going through church records and bank documents and the testimony of a midwife who had been tracked down in the countryside and had given, apparently, an extremely clear account of the circumstances of a birth 12 years ago. The case was coming together. The truth was finishing the process of coming out, and a girl in a blue wool coat walked along a garden path and was not frightened in the right way, which was the most useful way to not be frightened. The midwife's name was Mrs. Brent, and she had a memory that was extraordinary in the particular way of people who have attended a great many significant events and have never developed the habit of forgetting them. She was 63, living in a village about 2 hours from the city, and she had stopped working as a midwife 4 years ago when her joints began to protest the hours. But she remembered every birth she had attended. She said so plainly, sitting in her front room with Mr. Finch across from her, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating something obvious. "Lady Ashford," she said, when Mr. Finch told her the name. "Clara Ashford. Yes, I remember her very well. She was one of the most composed women I have ever attended in that situation. She was quite ill, the birth came early, and there were difficulties that I will not trouble you with the specifics of, but she was calm throughout, very deliberate. She said, at one point, that she had made arrangements, and that she needed to know the child was safe." "And the child?" Mr. Finch asked. "A girl," Mrs. Brent said. "Healthy, despite the early arrival. Good strong cry, dark hair, like her mother." She paused. Lady Ashford held her for a long time, longer than I expected, given the arrangements she had mentioned. She did not look like a woman who wanted to let go. Mr. Finch made his notes. "Was anyone else present?" he asked. "A woman. A relation of some kind. Lady Ashford called her Greta. She took the child when Lady Ashford was settled. I had the impression the arrangement had been made before the birth, but I asked no questions. It was not my place." "And Lady Ashford herself, did she seem?" "She seemed," Mrs. Brent said, with the particular precision of a woman who chose her words carefully, "like someone doing something that was breaking her heart, and doing it anyway because she believed it was necessary." Mr. Finch closed his notebook. He thanked Mrs. Brent. He arranged for her written statement to be taken by a clerk the following week. He left the village and sat in the coach on the way back to the city, with the notes open on his knee, and the particular feeling that he sometimes had at the end of a long inquiry, the feeling of all the pieces finally being in the same place and pointing in the same direction. He went directly to Ashford Manor and laid everything before Edmund in the study. "The midwife confirms the birth," he said. "The dates align. The christening record aligns. The financial record aligns. The testimony of Greta Voss, incomplete as it was, is consistent with everything else. We have Mrs. Brent's sworn statement, the original letter from Lady Ashford, the christening record from the church on Mercer Hill, the bank record, the testimony of Greta Voss, and your own identification of the girl as bearing a striking resemblance to your late wife." Edmund was looking at his desk. "Is it enough?" he asked. "For a voluntary recognition, yes, unambiguously. You have the right to recognize the child as your heir, and the documentation supports it. The only situation in which this would become contested is if another party mounted a legal challenge, at which point the court would examine what we have, and additional evidence would be sought." Edmund nodded. "Begin the paperwork for formal recognition," he said. Mr. Finch nodded. "I will need a few things from you. Signatures, sworn statements. I would also recommend that the girl herself be interviewed. Not extensively, not formally, simply a brief statement from her about what she knows of her own history and what she has been told. It strengthens the record." "I will speak to her about it," Edmund said. After Mr. Finch left, he sat for a long time in his study. He looked at Clara's photograph on the mantelpiece. He thought about the midwife saying that Clara had held the child longer than expected. He thought about the look on a woman's face, holding on to a child she was about to let go of. He thought about all the years between that moment and the moment Nadia had stood at his gate and said her name. He thought about what it cost a person to let go of something they needed to hold on to, and how long they could live with the letting go. He stood up. He went to find Nadia. She was in the library, in her usual chair, with a book in her lap. She looked up when he came in. He sat down in the other chair. He told her that the investigation was complete. He told her what Mr. Finch had found, laying it out the way Mr. Finch had laid it out for him, piece by piece, in order. The midwife, the dates, the documents, the way they all pointed in the same direction. Nadia listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens next?" "There will be a formal process," he said. "Documents, legal recognition. It will be straightforward as long as no challenge is mounted." "Arthur," she said. "Possibly." She looked at the book in her lap. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the cover. Then she looked up. "She held me," she said. "The midwife said she held me." It was not a question. She was saying it to hear it out loud. "Yes," Edmund said. She looked at the book for another moment. "All right," she said. "Tell me what I need to do." The papers were signed on a gray Friday, at the end of November, in Mr. Finch's office, in the presence of Edmund and Nadia, and 2 witnesses, and a clerk who recorded everything, with the speed and accuracy of long practice. Nadia sat in the chair across from Mr. Finch, and answered his questions, with the same clear directness she brought to everything, giving her account of her own history, without embellishment or evasion. Greta Voss, the 2 years on the street, the gate at Ashford Manor, the conversations with Lord Ashford. She said it all plainly, and the clerk wrote it down, and Mr. Finch asked his few follow-up questions, and it was done. They walked back to the manor in the cold, Edmund and Nadia, through the streets she had walked alone for 2 years. She pointed out the bookshop with the deep-set doorway. He looked at it. "Mr. Harvey," she said. "He used to bring me tea in the mornings. He never said anything about it. Would you like to go in and speak to him?" She considered it. "Yes," she said. "I think I should." They went in. Mr. Harvey was behind the counter, as always, in his round spectacles, surrounded by the smell of old paper. He looked up when they came in, and recognized Nadia immediately. He looked at the man beside her with careful eyes. Nadia said simply, "I wanted you to know I'm all right. I'm staying at Ashford Manor now." Mr. Harvey looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Edmund. Something passed between the 2 men, a piece of understanding that did not need words. "Good," Mr. Harvey said, to Nadia. "I'm glad to hear it." He paused. "The step's still there, if you ever want to sit on it and read." She smiled. It was the first full, unguarded smile Edmund had seen from her. "I have a library now," she said. "Better still," Mr. Harvey said. They left. Walking back through the cold streets, Edmund looked at Nadia. "You've built something here," he said. "In this city. Without anyone." She thought about this. "I had people," she said. "Just not in the usual way." He thought about that. They walked on through the city, in the cold and the noise of it, and then through the gate of the manor, which opened at a touch from Edmund's key, and up the path to the front door. The front door. Not the gate, the front door. She went through it as though she had been going through it her whole life. The letter from Mr. Holt arrived at Arthur's house on a Monday morning, 11 days after the papers had been signed. Mr. Holt had, through the careful inquiries he had been making, become aware of the completion of the formal recognition process. He had also become aware that it was solid, more solid than he had hoped or expected. The documentation was strong. The witness statements were clear. Mr. Finch had done his work with the thoroughness that was apparently characteristic of him, and the result was something that would be very difficult to challenge successfully. He wrote all of this in the letter, in the language of professional honesty that Arthur sometimes found irritating, because it refused to dress the truth in anything more comfortable than itself. Arthur read the letter at his breakfast table. He put it down and drank his coffee and looked at the wall. He thought about 12 years old. He thought about 2 years on the street. He thought about a girl standing at a gate in the cold, asking for bread she did not know was hers by right. He thought about what he had been ready to do. Not harm her, he told himself. Never harm her. But challenge the claim. Delay the process. Find whatever technical weakness existed in the documentation, and press it. And he thought about what that would have meant. A 12-year-old girl in a courtroom, or in the margins of one, being disputed like a property line. He put his coffee cup down. He sat for a while. Then he wrote a letter to Edmund. It was not the careful, weighted letter he had written before. It was shorter and more direct. It said that he understood a formal recognition had been completed. It said that he had no intention of mounting a challenge. It said that he would like, if Edmund was willing, to call on the family at the manor at some point in the coming weeks. He used the word family. He sent the letter. Then he sat back and thought about what it meant to have something you had expected for a long time and then not have it. It meant, he supposed, learning to want something different. He was not sure yet what that was, but he thought, on reflection, that knowing you did not have something was better than spending years pretending you did, and that the girl in the manor was probably not someone he needed to be afraid of. He would go and see for himself. The letter arrived at the manor that afternoon. Edmund read it in his study, and then took it to the library, where Nadia was in her chair with a different book. She looked up. He handed her the letter. She read it once. She read it again. "He's not going to challenge it," she said. "No." She looked at the letter for a moment longer. "He uses the word family," she said. "Yes." She set the letter on the table beside her. She thought about it for a moment, the word, and what it contained, and all the different things it could mean depending on who was saying it and what they expected from it. "Is he a decent person?" she asked. Edmund considered this honestly. "He is a person who has recently had to decide whether to be," he said. She thought about that. "That's fair," she said. She picked her book back up. She was 14 when Arthur came to the manor for Christmas. 2 years had passed since the papers were signed. 2 years of the library and the garden and the steady accumulation of ordinary days, which were, she had discovered, not ordinary at all when you had not had them before. 2 years of meals at a proper table and a bed with clean linens and a man who asked excellent questions at breakfast and brought her books he thought she might like and never once made her feel that any of it was temporary. 2 years of being Nadia Ashford, which was a name she had put on slowly. The way you put on a coat that fits. First the sleeves, then the rest of it. Then after a while you stop noticing you're wearing it, because it's simply what you wear. She was taller now. Mrs. Alton said she had grown 4 inches, which Mrs. Alton mentioned with the satisfaction of someone who had been feeding another person diligently, and was pleased to see evidence of the results. The garden was not bare anymore. Mr. Webb had taught her about the rose bushes over the course of the spring and summer, and she had learned to care for them, and knew the name of each variety and what it would do in July. She had learned about the kitchen garden too, the row of vegetables in the back corner that supplied the kitchen from June onward, and she had spent considerable time in it through the summer, with her sleeves rolled up, which Mrs. Alton thought was slightly beneath her station, and which Mr. Webb thought was excellent. She had worked her way through a significant portion of the library. She had also, in the way that happened when you had time and space and someone paying attention, begun to discover what she was good at, in the larger sense, what she could do with her mind when she had the resources to use it. She was very good with numbers, which had surprised Edmund until he remembered that she had spent 2 years managing very limited resources with considerable success, and that this was a form of mathematics, even if it did not look like one. He had arranged for a tutor, a capable and direct woman named Mrs. Orton, who came 3 days a week and who had, by the end of 6 months, told Edmund that Nadia was one of the most able students she had ever taught, and that he should begin thinking about what came after. He had begun thinking about it. Arthur arrived at the manor on a Tuesday afternoon in late December, his carriage coming up the drive just as the light was beginning to go gray at the edges of the afternoon. He was a tall man who looked somewhat like Edmund around the eyes, and he came in with the slightly careful manner of someone navigating a situation that mattered to him, and that he was not entirely certain how to handle. Nadia met him in the entrance hall. She had thought about what she wanted this to be. She had thought about it the way she thought about all things that mattered, carefully, from several angles, not rushing to a conclusion until she had examined enough of it. She did not need Arthur to be anything in particular to her. She did not need him to be sorry, or to be fond of her, or to be anything that he was not. What she needed was simply for this to be something manageable, because unmanageable things wasted energy, and energy was a resource she had learned to use well. She shook his hand. "Arthur," she said, "I'm glad you came." He looked at her. Something in his face settled. "So am I," he said, and she thought he probably meant it. They had tea in the sitting room, the same fire, though the chairs had been rearranged over the past 2 years, and there were books on the table now, and a drawing she had made of the garden, that Mrs. Alton had quietly framed and placed on the wall. Arthur looked at the drawing. "Did you do that?" he asked. "Mr. Webb showed me which plants were which," she said. "I wanted to remember them properly." He looked at it for another moment. "It's very good," he said. Edmund came in, and the three of them had tea, which was somewhat formal and somewhat not, which was probably the best that could be managed for a first meeting of this particular kind. Arthur asked her about her studies. She answered clearly and directly. He asked about the garden. She told him about the roses and the kitchen garden and what Mr. Webb had planned for the spring. Edmund listened and occasionally added something, and mostly watched the two of them finding their way toward each other, which was what he had hoped would happen. It was not all at once. It would not be all at once. But it was a beginning. After Arthur left, Nadia and Edmund sat by the fire in the sitting room, in the comfortable quiet that they had developed over 2 years. "What did you think?" Edmund asked. She thought about it. "He made a choice," she said, "to not challenge it. He didn't have to do that." "No," Edmund said. "That matters," she said. Edmund looked at the fire. "Yes," he said, "it does." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me something about my mother," she said. She said it simply, the way she said most things, without loading it with more weight than it needed to carry. She had asked him about Clara before, in pieces, over the past 2 years, and he had told her pieces in return. The way Clara laughed, the garden she had kept at the house before Ashford Manor, the particular way she had of saying things that were complicated as though they were simple. Edmund looked at the fire. "She liked bread," he said. "She had very particular opinions about bread. She said that the quality of a kitchen could be judged entirely by its bread, and that everything else was secondary." Nadia was very still for a moment. Then she said, "The bread at the gate was good." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "I know," he said. "She taught Mrs. Alton's predecessor the recipe. Mrs. Alton has kept it." Nadia thought about standing at the gate in the cold, holding a half loaf wrapped in cloth, eating it slowly behind the stone wall. She thought about the herbs in it, the names she had never learned. She thought about the fact that the bread had been made from a recipe she had inherited without knowing it. She thought that there were many ways to know someone, and that some of them did not require knowing. The fire in the grate was warm and steady. Outside the window, the city moved through its evening. She sat in her chair, in her house, by her father's fire, and she thought about bread, and about the kinds of things that find you, even when you have no idea you are being found. She thought that was enough to think about for tonight. She picked up her book, and the house went on around her, warm and solid and certain of itself, and she was part of it now, not as a visitor, not as a guest, not as a girl waiting at a gate. She was Nadia Ashford. She was home. 3 years after the papers were signed, when Nadia was 15, she began going to the gate herself. It had been her idea, arrived at quietly, without announcement, in the particular way that her best ideas arrived, as something that felt so obvious once she had thought of it that she could not remember what it had felt like not to think of it. She had spoken to Mrs. Alton first. She had explained what she wanted to do and why. In the practical and direct way she explained everything. Mrs. Alton had listened without changing her expression, which had become over 3 years a very particular kind of communication between them. The expression that meant, "Not only do I understand what you are asking, but I have been expecting you to ask it." They would need to expand the kitchen arrangement. More bread, more of the other things, cold meat, fruit when it was available, the vegetable soup that the kitchen made on Tuesday evenings that was more substantial than bread alone. They would need someone at the gate, and that someone would need to be consistent and reliable. "I'll be there myself," Nadia said. "Most Tuesdays." Mrs. Alton had said, with the slight emphasis that was her primary form of opinion, "Of course you will." It had taken 2 weeks to arrange properly. Edmund had been told, and had listened with the expression that she had come to know, the one that was not quite a smile, but was everything before a smile, and had said, simply, "Yes, that's the right thing." He had said nothing more. She had not needed him to. The first Tuesday she stood at the gate herself, on the inside, with the parcel of food in her hands. It was cold in the way that only November could be cold. Not the vicious cold of deep winter, but the gray cutting cold of the approach to it. The kind that got into your coat and stayed there. She had worn her blue wool coat, the one that fit. She stood and waited. The first person was a boy. He was about 10 years old, she thought, with a face that was thin from a summer that had not been generous, and he was wearing a coat that was too large for him, a man's coat, brown wool, hanging past his knees. He stopped on the other side of the gate. He did not hold out his hands. He waited. She looked at him for a moment. She recognized the waiting. She knew exactly what it cost to wait like that, instead of reaching out. The particular discipline of it, the dignity it required, the way it was both a protection and a risk. She opened the gate. She held out the parcel. He took it with both hands. "Thank you," he said. He said it clearly. She looked at him. "There's more if you need it," she said. "Come around the back on Thursday mornings and ask for Mrs. Alton. She'll have something hot." He looked at her. He looked at the parcel in his hands. He looked back at her with the careful, assessing look of a child who has learned to check all the sides of a thing before deciding whether to trust it. She let him look. "All right," he said at last. He turned and walked away down the street, tucking the parcel under one arm, in the particular way she recognized, not too fast, not too slow, just moving with the calm efficiency of someone who knows where they are going next and how to get there. She watched him go. Behind her, somewhere in the house, the warmth and the light of the room she lived in were going on without her, patient and waiting, in no hurry. She stood at the gate until the boy turned the corner and disappeared, and she thought about bread and gates and the way things found each other across distance and time, the way some connections happened without either party knowing they were happening, until they were already made. She thought about a Tuesday evening 3 years ago, behind a stone wall in the cold, eating a half loaf slowly. She thought about her mother's recipe, carried forward through the hands of someone who had never met her, fed to a girl who had not known whose hands it came from. She thought about the way good things could travel through time, without anyone directing them, moving from person to person in the ordinary way of bread, made by one pair of hands, given by another, received by a third, warming each of them in turn. She pulled the gate closed. She walked back up the path to the front door. She went inside. She went to the library, where a fire was already lit and her usual chair was where it always was, and she sat down and opened the book she was halfway through, and she read until dinner. At dinner, Edmund asked about the gate. She told him about the boy. "He'll come Thursday?" Edmund asked. "I think so," she said. "He has good instincts." Edmund nodded. They ate the rest of dinner in the comfortable quiet, and the candles on the table made the room warm and close, and outside the city went on doing what cities did, moving and making noise and being full of people who were finding each other, or not finding each other, depending on everything that had gone before. In the kitchen, Mrs. Alton was already making a note in her household book about Thursday morning. More bread, more soup. She made the note in her careful hand and turned the page, and the house went on.